Well, welcome back, critical thinkers. This is going to be our second discussion of the media and how the media shapes perception. And as a critical thinker, how it's important to consider how the media influences our thoughts, influences our opinions, so that we can be on guard against it. So that if we're going to make a good decision about what to believe, we recognize that the media shapes our thoughts. And so you should have the second media lecture notes open, entitled Media 2, and then it says the power of the media on the first slide. And on the first slide is actually an infographic that it's just a chart that is accurate. It only ranges from 1983 to 2004, but it's remained relatively stable since then. And what it tracks along the x-axis is the year, 1983, 1984, 1985. And what it tracks along the y-axis is the number of companies that independently control mass media outlets. So things like newspapers, magazines, TV, radio, books, music, videos, photo agencies, news, all of it, right? And what you can see over time is because of like mergers and acquisitions, different companies buying and selling each other, the number of companies that own mass media information outlets has shrunk from over 50 companies down to only 5 as of 2004. Now there are actually 6 mega conglomerates, multinational companies that control the mass media. Control the U.S. mass media. And why is this a problem? Well, we remember from last time we talked about how people underestimate the extent to which their own opinions are being driven by media sources. We often don't reflect on how the media shapes our values and shapes our opinions about the world. And when you note that only 5 or 6 companies are controlling the mass media, you have to sort of ask yourself, how many unique points of view am I getting, right? Because although there are relatively independent sub-organizations or sub-companies underneath these big behemoth companies like Disney and Viacom, really, opinions trickle down, right? Whoever is in charge of the company is going to influence the people below them in terms of what points of view to consider. And those people are going to influence people under them. And so in a very sort of real way, I would argue that when there are only 5 or 6 companies that control the mass media, you end up with fewer points of view, fewer unique points of view, or at least points of view are being filtered through 5 or 6 lenses of orientation. And given how much people underestimate how much they're affected by the media, you have a huge chunk of the population, 80% of the population, who is underestimating the extent to which their opinions are being shaped by only 5 or 6 points of view. And so you have a narrowing of sources of information, at least if you get your information from the mass media outlets. And so I think it's important for us to sort of push back at, or at least recognize, the kinds of tactics that the mass media uses to shape our points of view. Before I move on to that, I just want to mention briefly the last video you watched, which was Killing Us Softly 4, which was really a critical analysis of gender and how gender is portrayed in the media. And as I mentioned last time, it's a little bit an older video. It's from 2010. But I think many aspects that are very relevant. And so whether or not you agree with all of it, I do want you to at least be aware of her main points of view. She really argues for a hypersexualization of femininity in the culture, that women are first and foremost evaluated as sexual objects. Certainly in the media, and then that portrayal in the media of hypersexualized objects influences how we view women in everyday life. And I would, if I were you, for your future life, maybe say on the exam, I would be able to sort of cite specific examples from that video that sort of supports your point of view, that in the media landscape, women are hypersexualized objects. She also makes the point that our definition of beauty has become increasingly thin, at least up until 2010. So there's a very thin standard of beauty. And so we end up with an unhealthy relationship with food in the media. And so cite some specific examples that support that point of view. The idea that we have sort of an unhealthy relationship with food, and there's an incredibly thin standard of beauty, at least there has been historically up until 2010. Be able to cite some specific examples she has to support that idea. She also argues for an impossible standard of beauty, right? An impossible standard of beauty. And so I would be able to cite some specific advertisements or examples that she gave to support that point of view. She also argues for a sort of a toxic definition of masculinity. The idea that to be feminine is to be less than. And if one is to be sort of male, you have to sort of reject any femininity at all, and men are sort of defined by their rejection of femininity, and be able to cite some specific examples that support that idea of sort of a violent, emotionally repressed point of view of masculinity in the mass media, right? So I definitely see you, whether you agree with it or not, being responsible for at least knowing what her points of view are, what the main points of her talk were, and be able to be familiar with some of the specific examples that she gave in the video. All right, so now to today's topic, the power of the media, right? Moving on to slide 2. So it's easy for me to tell you that, that we're affected by the mass media, but I want to actually give you some specific research examples that support my contention that people are in fact influenced by the mass media. And I'm going to use the example of pornography because then I'm guessing you'll remember it, right? If I talk about pornography, I'm guessing you'll remember it. But when I go over this research on pornography, which is an example of how the media can shape our perceptions of femininity and masculinity, I want you to keep in mind that this is not special. Porn is not special. The effects that I'm about to share with you about how pornography can alter our thinking about men and women, be aware that pornography is not unique in this way. And the same effects we see for pornography, we actually see for any mass media consumption. When you consume mass amounts of media, you end up with these effects. All right, so now to this classic study done in 1984. And here's what they did. This was a true experiment. So if you remember our discussion of true experiments, this is going to be an experiment where they actually manipulated something. And what they manipulated was how much pornography people watched. They recruited a bunch of men and women, and they had them, they manipulated an independent variable where they had them watch either 0, 18, or 36 pornographic films. So they had 3 different groups for their independent variable, where they watched one or the other, 0, 18, or 36 pornographic films. And then their dependent variable was their attitudes about women after reading a rape trial, the outcome of a rape trial, as well as what they referred to then as the women's liberation movement, or we might call it feminism nowadays. So their independent variable was having these people, whether they wanted to or not, of course they all had to volunteer, they had these individuals watch large amounts of pornography versus a moderate amount of pornography, 18 pornographic films, or zero pornography, right? And this was over a 1-week period. And so then at the end, they had them read about a rape trial, recommend sentences for the hypothetical rapist, and then also ask their attitudes about women. And what they found, moving on to slide 3, was the people who had watched a large number of pornographic films recommended a lighter rape sentence for the rapist, like a prison sentence for the rapist. They were more hostile towards the concepts of feminism, and they were more likely to endorse rape myths, so basically blame the victim for the rape in the scenario. And this was true for both male and female participants. So everybody who watched the large amount of pornography sort of became more hostile towards, had more hostile attitudes about women, and were more permissive about rape. And so you can sort of think about why this is, right? What is going on in these pornographic films? Is you see males in very dominant roles. Very typical pornography has men in very dominant roles and women in very submissive roles. And, the sex play between them is also often one of a dominant male and a submissive female. That's just really typical of pornography. And certainly that was true back in the 80s. That was sort of the typical porn trope. The plot is, aggressive, or, well, not aggressive, but dominant male comes in and, has sex with a more submissive, retiring female. But what's important to recognize is that these same sort of results happen when we have people watch large amounts of media where there's a dominant female, a dominant male, so a man in a more dominant position, and women in more submissive positions. And it doesn't need to be sexual, right? If you just show men and women in highly stereotypical roles with a more powerful man and a relatively less powerful woman, you show very similar effects. Right? It's true for pornography, but it's also true of most sitcoms, where men are often portrayed in more powerful roles than women, or even in dramas. Only 30% of speaking roles in Hollywood productions go to women, and 70% go to men. And of those speaking roles, women are often relegated to more submissive roles in the movies. In fact, there's a trope in films of the strong female, because that's not what's typical. And so oftentimes movies will try to make sure they have a strong female, right? As if a strong female is all you need. And so I think that there is this sort of undercurrent in modern media, that you have often men portrayed in these very strong positions of power or influence, or even in just personality, where women are less likely to be portrayed in that fashion. Of course, we can think of many counterexamples where strong females are portrayed, but that's not the baseline, right? That's not the average. That's not what's typical. And we see from this one study on pornography that when you sort of give people very stereotypical images of men and women, that can alter their perceptions. But I should be careful to note that there's been decades and decades of research on pornography and its effects on individuals, and by and large, watching pornography doesn't actually change how men and women relate to one another in terms of behavior. And it doesn't actually make men more violent. It doesn't make them more aggressive, right? And so with the one example of violent pornography is more likely to make some men more aggressive. But typical pornography, where you simply see sort of stereotypical men in powerful roles and stereotypical submissive women in relatively less powerful roles, just sort of solidifies male and female, the sort of the male and female stereotypes, right? And so, but it's not the sexual content of the pornography that's leading to these effects, right? It's not the sexual content of the pornography that's leading men and women to recommend lighter rape sentences or to be more likely to endorse rape myths. It's not the sexual component, right? I share with you the example with pornography so you remember it, right? What matters is that men and women are being depicted in these stereotypical ways that happens to be in the sexual realm. And anytime you show a large number of media images with men in more powerful roles and women in more submissive roles, you end up with these effects, with being more hostile towards feminism, more likely to endorse rape myths, and more likely to recommend lighter sentences for rapists. Right? So the media matters, right? And what we consume in the media matters very much. Another example of how the mass media can shape our perceptions is the body of evidence that suggests that watching violent images can actually change how we behave, right? So watching typical pornography doesn't actually alter how people behave. It's yet another example that shapes our thinking about men and women, but doesn't actually make people more aggressive, unless it's violent pornography. Because there's a huge amount of evidence that suggests watching violence, period, on television or watching violent movies can in fact lead to more aggressive attitudes as well as aggressive behaviors, particularly among children. This is particularly true among children. And there isn't a whole lot of debate among scholars about these effects. There are true experiments that demonstrate if you take in violent media images, aggressive media content, this actually, in terms of cause and effect, can lead people to become more aggressive. They have these really cool paradigms where they basically show people large amounts of violent television or violent movies, and then have them they basically stage some sort of negative interaction with a research assistant, and then lo and behold, in a second part of the experiment, they're given an opportunity to behave aggressively towards that research assistant, and the people who watched the large amounts of violent media images are more likely to be aggressive. So it's a cause and effect relationship. And this also works in the field, right? We have confirmatory evidence in the field as well. When they do observational and correlational research among actual individuals in their homes, you have this sort of the same effect emerging, that more violent and aggressive media content consumption is associated with more violent and aggressive behavior. And there's even a type of analysis called a meta-analysis that actually looks at the whole body of research on the effects of violent media on aggressive behaviors, and the research is just really overwhelming, that the more violent images that you consume, the more aggressive people tend to be in a cause and effect relationship. Does that mean that anybody who watches a bunch of Quentin Tarantino movies is going to go out and become a mass murderer? Of course not. Does that mean that if you are a big fan of violent action movies, you're going to be this horribly aggressive, violent person? Of course not. But the more violent images you take in, the more likely it is that maybe you will be a little more aggressive when interacting with other people as an adult. As an adult, we have very large frontal lobes that allows us to override our aggressive tendencies. And so even if watching very violent media or playing very violent video games, which is an example of media, does make you somewhat more likely to be aggressive, as a fully grown, developed adult, you have the ability to sort of override maybe those mild increases in aggressive tendencies. So I'm not at all suggesting that we censor movies or video games that are violent, but just be aware that the more violent media you consume, this may have a mild increase in your tendencies to be aggressive. Where there's a bigger cause for concern is the research that indicates that these cause and effect relationships happen with children as well, and that these effects, watching violent media can make them more aggressive, are much more pronounced. They're much more significant, and the effects are just simply more powerful. And so just keep that in mind, that the research is pretty clear that the more violent and aggressive television and video games children consume, the more likely they are to actually become aggressive themselves. And the effects are just stronger with children, particularly children below the age of 7 is one sort of marker, and then also below the age of 12. Children under 7 are just particularly impressionable. They don't appear to have the ability to contextualize the images that they see. They have sort of a reduced ability to know who exactly is the good guy, who exactly is the bad guy, who exactly am I supposed to be identifying with. Children over the age of 7 are better able to do that. Not that you don't see this relationship in older children, because you do. You even see it in adults. I also want to mention that although these effects are more pronounced in children, there's a lot parents can do to actually contextualize the violence and aggression that they see in the TV. They've done several studies that had parents watch the TV with their children. And when parents watch TV with their kids and sort of engage in a dialogue with them about sort of the images that they see, like saying, oh, wow, he was calling him names. That's not very nice. That would make me sad. Then when parents actually watch the TV with their kids, this actually does a lot to sort of minimize the effects of aggressive or violent, scenes in children's programming. And there's a lot of violence in kids' programming. Think Pokemon or Mighty Morphin Power Rangers or any superhero cartoons. There's a lot of violence where the heroes are solving the problems through violence. And this can, in fact, lead to increases in aggressive behavior in children. The experimental evidence is really clear, as well as the field studies. But if you're a parent, if you watch these shows or movies with your children and talk about what they see and contextualize it for them, that can do a lot to minimize the effects on behavior. Of course, that requires parents to actually watch the TV with their kids as opposed to just sort of turning it on and walking away, right? And so definitely the research indicates that we are, in fact, cause and effect affected by the media that we watch. Which leads us to slide 5 and sort of the second part of our discussion today. I want to use the televised news as an example of really toxic media, of media that does not do a good job of informing, right? But not just the televised media, also a lot of sort of partisan, which means magazines and newspapers with a clear point of view that are not really working very hard to be neutral. I want to sort of talk about these media outlets as examples of news organizations whose goal is to not really inform. The goal is to entertain. The goal is to sell you a product. And I want to talk about the tricks that they use to alter your thinking and alter your perception. All right, so to slide number 6. Keep in mind that the televised news doesn't actually give you the news, right? What they cover is what's called sensationalism. The televised news covers the things that they think will be interesting and will keep your eyeballs stuck to the screen, right? They're under no obligation to be fair. They're under no obligation to be balanced, and they're under no obligation to give you an accurate sense of what the world is really like, right? I've never seen on the televised news them say, and today 99% of all people drove home and it was uneventful, got home safe, made dinner, and went to bed, right? Even though that's in fact what most people experience, right? Or I've never seen a televised news that said, okay, there were this many car accidents today. Even though that's one of the leading causes of death and injury, they're not giving like a running total of the number of car accidents that caused injury. They'll only cover car accidents if there was some huge, major, bizarre pileup. Or they'll cover a plane crash, which affects hardly anybody. Or they'll cover a child abduction, which hardly happens ever. The televised news covers the things that are bizarre, sensational, so they're interesting. But what that does is create a real climate of fear, right? Every Halloween, the televised news suggests that parents check their kids' Halloween candy when there has never been a single documented case of poisoned Halloween candy. Ever. There has been the occasional documented case of like putting push pins in candy, but usually those are within the same family. They can usually track it to it being some sort of practical joke. This idea that people are going around every year poisoning Halloween candy, yeah, not a thing. Doesn't happen. But we're afraid of it, right? Or how about stranger danger? Stranger danger? Do we teach our kids that? Why? Because the nightly news, the televised news and newspapers publishes these incredibly rare events where a child is abducted by a stranger. There are fewer than 100 stranger kidnappings every year. Fewer than 100, right? That is, I mean, and although I feel terrible for the families who experience stranger abduction, you are literally, there are 10 times more fatal car accidents that have to do with children than there are stranger abductions. It is literally safer for you to have your 5-year-old child walk home alone by themselves through a park than it is to get them in the car and drive them home yourself. I mean, it's about risk assessment, and the televised news and the sensational media, they make us afraid of the wrong things. They don't make us concerned about car safety. They make us afraid of stranger danger when so few people are ever abducted by strangers. Children are orders of magnitude more likely to be victimized, assaulted, and kidnapped by their own family members than they are ever to be victimized by a stranger. fewer than 100 a year abducted by strangers. And yet we walk around acting as if children are going to be snatched at any moment. If parents let their children, older children, 7, 8, 9, if parents let their children play at a park, then somehow those parents are bad parents, right? If parents let their children go and be independent and ride their bike at 8, 9, 10 years old, in some states they can be reported to Child Protective Services. There was a documented case of a 10-year-old walking home alone with his 6-year-old sister being reported to Child Protective Services for neglect, right? Their parents were neglectful. And I think there's a growing body of evidence to suggest it's making our children afraid, making our children lose their sense of independence, their sense of being able to explore their world. In 1970s, in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, children 7, 8, 9 years old went out and played by themselves all the time. And now the world is a safer place. There are fewer violent crimes. There are fewer. The world is a safer place nowadays than it was in the 50s and 60s, and yet we're more on guard about our children and more terrified that something bad is going to happen to them. When in reality, it's so unlikely. There are 300 million people living in the United States, and fewer than 100 children every year are victims of stranger abduction. It just doesn't happen hardly ever. And constantly making decisions about our child's welfare based on these incredibly small risks just doesn't make a lot of sense. Not when it teaches our children to be afraid. Not when it distracts us from real dangers, right? Real dangers like child obesity. Not letting our children go and play at the park because we're afraid of some stranger abduction is irrational. And part of the reason why we walk around in this state of fear is the televised news and sensational reporting and where newspapers and magazines and television shows are constantly reminding us of these sensational events so that we become afraid of them. Be aware that occurs, that the nightly news is not selling you on truth. They're selling you on interesting. Moving on to slide 7. There's other things the televised news sort of create our sense of what is important. For example, anything that the televised news or a newspaper talks about first, so anything on the front page or anything anything right at the top of the broadcast, is sort of subtly suggests that it's more important, right? So, and this is true of online magazines and newspapers as well, right? Like when I'm online and I'm on like Yahoo News, if the very first story is covering something like a pop star like Kim Kardashian or whomever, some pop star or sensational personality, that subtly creates the impression that this person is important, right? So where you put something, putting it first, covering it first, subtly manipulates our perception of what's important. Also, spending more time talking about something suggests that it's important, right? So you think about political campaigns. During the political season, if a television broadcasting company or a newspaper spends a considerable amount of time talking about someone, that creates this impression that this person is important, right? And all of these things then shift perception. Moving on to slide 8. If you think about a lot of news outlets do interviews, keep in mind that the television news outlet, the interviewer, has the power to choose who comes on, and they have the power to choose how they portray them, right? They can create a hostile interview environment. They can create a positive interview environment to create the impression that the person is incompetent or create the impression that the person is competent. And all of it is manipulative, right? And who they just have on to represent a particular point of view, right? A particular news outlet may have like 2 people engaged in a debate, but they make sure to select somebody inarticulate and uneducated to represent one point of view and make sure to have somebody very articulate and educated present the other. And it's manipulative, and they do it all the time. None of these televised news outlets really have like the public good as their bottom line. Unless you're PBS or, National Public Radio, It's not even in your mission statement to try to give people an informed point of view. All of these other televised news outlets, CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, all of them, they're beholden to the people who pay them. These are for-profit institutions, and what they want to get you to do is watch their show, right? They're not a not-for-profit public service, right? That's not their goal. Their goal is to get you to watch. And so they're under no obligation, and really, they're not even really motivated to actually create an informed public. They just want you to they want to get you to watch. And often, they're pushing a particular agenda. And different news outlets are often very partisan, right? It should really come as no shock that Fox News has a very conservative bent, because the person who actually runs Fox News, sort of the parent organization, that person is politically conservative. MSNBC, it's the same story except from the liberal point of view. Who owns MSNBC? They have a liberal slant, and it trickles down to how they cover various issues. It's biased, and so they don't end up giving you the whole story. They don't even have to. They're not even required to give you the whole story. Back in the 1980s, before the 1980s, there was actually this federal law, or federal rule called the Fairness Doctrine. And it was this idea that since the televised news outlets were using public airwaves, that they had an obligation to be balanced, that they had to be fair, they had to give equal and accurate airtime to multiple points of view. But in the 1980s, they did away with it. They said that was a violation of free speech, and you couldn't dictate what these news outlets talked about. You couldn't dictate how they talked about issues anymore. And I'm not here to tell you that doing away with the Fairness Doctrine was a bad thing. I mean, there is a point of view that sort of free speech should trump other considerations. But be aware that all of these news organizations are not legally in any way required to provide you with a full picture. They're not required to be fair. They're not required to be balanced. They're just required to get you to watch, because that's their goal. Moving on to slide 9. There are some really subtle things that televised news outlets can do to manipulate your perception of various issues. So think about the props that often get used, right, on these various news organizations to sort of create subtle impressions. And the one that I like the most is when morning shows, right? Morning shows, they will always have cups of coffee in front of their commentators. And this is actually, which you will not see on the nightly news. And this actually creates sort of feelings of intimacy, right? You're sitting down to have coffee with the ladies at The View. Sort of, it creates a sense of trust, a sense of everyday interaction. But other things too, like big American flags everywhere, sort of create sort of a positive feeling. So the set can be subtly manipulative. Moving on to slide 10. Other things too, like what kind of clothing they put people in can often sort of shift and change how you view people. Notice that the people in the morning shows are often dressed more casually than people in the nightly news. The people in the nightly news are invariably dressed in very, very formal business attire, which sort of suggests professionalism. It suggests that these people are knowledgeable. In reality, they're just reading off a teleprompter, right? But also how other things that these televised news outlets can manipulate is the labels that they actually put over people who are talking, right? Now, usually examples aren't as extreme as this, but you can imagine, like on one news outlet, let's say there's a Democrat politician, and if that person is talking and being televised by Fox News, it might have embattled liberal politician, right, some negative label. Or over at MSNBC, which is a more liberal outlet, it might say respected Democrat from Massachusetts. And all of it can be highly manipulative and on purpose. Slide 11. Other subtle things that the television news and television news outlets can do to manipulate your point of view is camera angles. Camera angles can actually manipulate your your perception of people. For example, if you take a camera, like for example, I'll do this. For example, if I take this camera and I move it over here and I start shooting me from above, I become very powerful, right? Versus if I take the camera and I move it like this and I look up at the camera, I start to seem more diminutive, more powerless. And these are sort of the things that they can do in the televised news or in interviews to create subtle perceptions of power, make their guests look more powerful, or make their guests look more powerless, right? It's the same idea. Or pulling in close can create a sense of intimacy. Do you see how intimate we feel now? Like we're best friends. Versus if I pull out like this can actually, the distance can create a sense of emotional distance. And televised news outlets do this on purpose. They use the camera angles to create feelings in their audience. Also, sound bites can be cut to make it seem like a person said something that they didn't, right? So for example, let's say I'm a politician and I'd say, of course I would never agree with the idea that we need to take money from everybody, take money from everyone in the United States. You might, if you're a nefarious, manipulative news outlet, only have the part where they say, we should take money from everyone in the United States, and cut off the part where the person is saying, I would never support the idea that we should take money from everyone in the United States. There have been several documented accounts of different news organizations cutting and splicing together sound bites to make it seem like a person said the opposite of what they intended, right? It happens all the time. And so moving on to slide 12, sorry, took a little break there, so the lighting's a little different now, don't get freaked out. So moving on to slide 12, I think it's important to recognize, so just in general, how television organizations really can choose. They can choose how to frame things. They can choose how to basically shade the world to sort of leave you with different impressions, right? And this is almost always deliberate. It's almost always intentional. And so just as a good critical thinker, we have to be aware of it. Close-up angles create intimacy. Wide shots create a feeling of distance. And these shots are deliberate. Deliberate ways to unconsciously manipulate how you think and feel about things. And this is true in televised media, and it's just as true in the print media, right? Where you choose to put stories in the front of the paper, the back of the paper, or the front of the magazine, back of the magazine, or if you're talking about online resources, on the front page versus buried 6 stories down in your news feed, right? It all matters, and it all affects how you think about a particular topic, right? How they compose photos, all of these are manipulative, right? So moving on to slide 14, I want you to just ask yourself this question. Really critically think on this question. Does the media just shape reality, or does reality guide the media? Does it have to be one or the other, right? Yes, the media takes a snapshot of society as it currently is, but it gets to pick and choose which facets of society it chooses to cover, right? And then that in turn shapes society, right? We're absolutely being manipulated. At least I would argue that we're certainly being bought and sold. Our dollars are being purchased, and news outlets are in the effort of selling ad time. And so their goal is to get you to think and feel about things in a way that are going to make you more likely to sort of fit the agenda of the people making the news. So moving on to slide 15, here is just sort of a summary of all the different ways that television news organizations can manipulate how you think and feel about things. They can use fuzzy words, basically manipulate language the way we've discussed in the past. Of course, they can use logical fallacies to make things sound better than they are. Celebrity endorsements, which may or may not have any validity. product placements, putting things directly in the story. Something called using social media, neuromarketing, where they can actually track people's emotional reactions to things. Eye tracking, where they can track what your eyes look at as you're walking through malls, right? Making things look better than they are. It's called stylized images and sounds, where, for example, like when you see pictures of ice cream, it's almost always butter because it makes it look better than it is, right? And so just keep in mind that there's all of these many myriad techniques to separate you from your money, right? And it's all manipulative and it's all purposeful. It's got an agenda. So one that you may not be aware of is something called the Gestalt principle that I just want to cover a little more deeply because you may not be aware of it. So the Gestalt principle is the idea in advertising that the whole is more than the sum of its parts, right? And we have this basic psychological tendency as people to fill in the blanks. It's why, for example, if I sing this song, shave and a haircut, 2 bits, or twinkle, twinkle, little star, or we all want to finish things. And so advertisers often will use this intentionally because they know we have this psychological tendency to want to complete things, right? And so they'll do this on purpose. They'll leave things incomplete so that we fill in the details, right? And that's another sort of subtle marketing technique that you may not be aware of. Also keep in mind, moving on to slide 17, that social media can be used deceptively, can be used manipulatively. For example, and we'll talk more about this next time, right? We'll talk about sort of the power of social media. But keep in mind that not everything you see on social media is factual. I'm a big fan of Yelp, but a lot of those Yelp reviews are actually false, right? So you just have to be sort of a savvy consumer of social media, which we'll talk more about in our next video. Another couple of things I want to talk to you about, because you may not be aware of them, are things like eye tracking software, which is being used in big malls now. We actually sort of record what people are looking at in order to target the ads that they see as they walk by these sort of visual billboards as they walk through the mall. That's totally a thing. That totally happens. I was just in the Mall of America in Minnesota not that long ago, and they actually had clearly these eye tracking billboards where I felt as I was walking through the mall, the ads were basically targeting the things that I'd been looking at. They definitely have them in Europe too. And this sort of actually reminds me of online marketing techniques where if you ever gone to Amazon and you were looking at something and then 10 minutes later you were on Facebook and suddenly all over Facebook are a bunch of ads for the things you were looking at on Amazon, sort of creepy and totally here and happens all the time. Neuromarketing, moving on to slide 19, is one of the ways that they track unconscious emotional reactions to products. It's essentially marketing researchers have people interact with products while they're giving them fMRI scans, which is a brain imaging scanner, to sort of note people's sort of emotional reactions to products, to basically design the products better. But another aspect of neuromarketing is actually subliminal persuasion, to basically market things subliminally. Subliminal priming is totally a legit thing. You can actually show someone a picture so fast that they're not even consciously aware that they've seen it. It's called priming. Now, advertisers say that they don't use subliminal messages. And I'm just not sure if I believe them, to be quite frank, because we know that you can flash someone a picture so fast that they're not even aware that they've seen it, which then can subtly change how they think and feel about things. And the idea that marketers are not using these techniques, I find suspect. And the last thing I want to talk about with how powerful the media is something that's becoming more and more relevant as people get DVRs and people have Netflix where they're not watching commercials anymore. And it's a concept called product placement. And really, product placement is the idea of putting the marketing idea, the product you want to sell, directly into the movie or the television show that somebody is watching, right? It's the idea that maybe you're watching a show, instead of just interacting with a computer, the person is specifically interacting with an Apple. Or instead of interacting with just any old tablet, they're specifically interacting with the iPad. Or instead of driving any old car, they're driving a Ford. So it's product placement. And you can think of it as like a reaction to the fact that we don't watch commercials anymore because nobody wants to watch them because you can just fast forward through them. But it's actually even more powerful than that. Product placements have been around since the very start of television, the very start of television, where people were interacting with a product specifically. And what they find is product placements are actually sometimes more persuasive than commercials themselves, because what happens is that you're caught up in the story, and so you're not thinking about the product, and as a result, you're subliminally becoming attached to the product as you become attached to the characters in the show. And so it's actually the persuasive power of storytelling that can actually make product placements even more compelling, right? Like, for example, in the Transformer movie, he's not just driving any old car, he's driving a Camaro. Or like in like Sex and the City was something I watched 10 or 15 years ago. She wasn't just wearing any old shoes, she was wearing Jimmy Choo's and Manolo Blahniks. Product placement. And I bet you can bet dimes to dollars that those companies paid to have their products there. And in fact, if you watch television shows, oftentimes they'll have the product names blurred out because they don't want to give people free advertising. And all of this is manipulative. And as a critical thinker, I'm not suggesting you throw away your television, right? I'm just suggesting that if you want to not be as influenced by things, you have to become more consciously aware that you are being influenced. And then if you choose to sort of let those persuasive messages affect you, that's fine. But recognize that the persuasive attempt is there. So you can be on guard against it if you would prefer not to be persuaded by these sales tactics and by these sort of subtle tactics of news organizations to get you to think and feel a certain way, right? So slide 21. A good critical thinker is aware of advertising, marketing, and subtle news techniques to shift around your perception, shift around your attitudes to get you to think and feel about things the way the news organization or the advertisers want you to, right? A good critical thinker is aware that they are being manipulated, so they can be manipulated, less, right? All right. Well, until next time, critical thinkers, we have one more lecture until our third exam. We have a lecture on social media, so Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Tumblr, Pinterest. Insert social media here, right? Which is really sort of the new way that we're learning to communicate with each other. It's not so much the mass media anymore, but social media that is more and more the way people share information. And so a good critical thinker is aware, uses this new tool, well, relatively new, since 2006 or so, this relatively more new tool of social media with care. Right? Because it has tons and tons of really positive aspects to it, but also some things that need to be used with caution. All right, until next time.